The wind howled across the Kansas prairie like a wounded animal, driving rain sideways into Clara Morrison's face. Each drop hit like a slap, cold and sharp, but she didn't slow her mare. She couldn't. Behind her, the storm roared like an angry god, swallowing the horizon in gray fury. Ahead, there was nothing but endless mud and the faint hope of shelter. She'd been riding since dawn. Her horse, Buttercup, stumbled again, head low, sides quivering with exhaustion. Clara leaned forward, whispering through chattering teeth, "Just a little more, girl. We'll find somewhere soon." The prairie offered nothing. No trees, no fences, no signs of life, just miles of soaked grass bending flat under the wind. Then, through the haze of rain, she saw it, a dark shape rising like a ship on a wild sea. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks. But no, it was a house. A big one. 2 stories, white paint peeling under the storm, a wide porch wrapping around its front. Smoke curled from the chimney, faint but real. Relief rushed through her like warmth, returning to frozen fingers. She guided Buttercup toward it. A wooden sign swung violently from its post, the faded black letters barely legible. Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house, hospitality, and shelter for weary travelers. Clara almost laughed with relief. She'd heard of such places, safe havens for travelers, run by respectable widows or spinsters. Places where a woman could find a bed and hot food without fear of unwanted company. She found a small stable beside the house. Inside, 3 stalls were already occupied by well-groomed horses. At least the owner cared for her guests, animals. Clara unsaddled Buttercup, rubbing her down with straw and filling her bucket with water. "Rest easy, girl," she murmured. "We're safe tonight." Then, clutching her saddlebags and rifle, she ran through the rain to the porch. The moment her boots hit the steps, she hesitated. Her split riding skirt was caked in mud, her coat soaked through. Her hair hung in wet strands beneath her hat. She probably smelled like wet horse and dust. But any boarding house on the frontier had seen worse. She knocked firmly. The door opened at once. A woman stood there, tall, maybe 50, with silver hair pulled back tight in a severe bun. Her black dress was plain but immaculate, high-collared and long-sleeved. Widow's clothes. Her face might have once been handsome, but years of hard living had carved deep lines around her mouth. Yet it was her eyes that caught Clara's breath. Pale, icy blue, sharp as winter frost. "Another traveler caught in God's fury," the woman said. "Come in, child, before you freeze where you stand." Clara stepped into a hallway lit by oil lamps. Warmth hit her like a physical blow, making her shiver harder as her body remembered the cold. The air smelled of stew and fresh bread. Her stomach twisted with hunger. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, pushing wet hair from her face. "I'm Clara Morrison, on my way to Dodge City. The storm caught me unprepared." "Storms do that out here." The woman locked the door behind her with a heavy click. "I'm Mrs. Magnolia Whitmore. This is my home. You'll be needing supper and a dry bed." "I can pay," Clara said, reaching for her purse. "Mrs. Rees," Whitmore waved a hand. "Payment can wait. No sense talking business while you're dripping on my floors. Come along." She led Clara down a long hall lined with faded photographs. The house was larger inside than it looked, rooms branching off in odd directions, furniture neat but worn, everything clean yet somehow weary, like it had been holding its breath for years. They entered a dining room where 3 men sat eating in silence. They looked up when Clara entered, and something in their faces made her pause. They were well-dressed, far too well for this lonely patch of Kansas. One looked 40, with thinning hair and a St. Louis suit. Another was younger, bearded, wearing a silk vest and a brocade cravat. The third, barely out of his 20s, had a gold watch chain glinting across his chest. But their faces, something was wrong. Despite their neat clothes, they looked hollow, eyes sunken, expressions blank, as if something vital had been drained out of them. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Whitmore said smoothly. "This is Miss Morrison. She'll join us for supper." Quote, the men nodded together, perfectly in sync, like puppets pulled by the same string. None spoke. Clara sat where Mrs. Whitmore indicated. The silence pressed on her like a weight. Mrs. Whitmore soon returned with a tray. Beef stew, cornbread, steaming coffee. Clara's hunger overcame her unease. The food was rich, hot, real. As she ate, she noticed Mrs. Whitmore didn't touch a bite herself. She only watched Clara, those pale eyes, never blinking. "You're traveling alone?" the widow asked finally. "Yes, ma'am. My aunt in Dodge City is poorly. I'm her only kin." "Dangerous, traveling alone," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Outlaws, drifters, savages." Clara's hand brushed the Colt, .45 at her hip. "I can take care of myself." Mrs. Whitmore's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you can. Still, it's a blessing you found my house. You'll be safe here tonight." The way she said safe made Clara's skin crawl. She looked to the three men. They'd finished eating but didn't move. They just sat with hands folded, eyes dull. "Your other guests seem tired," Clara said lightly. "Oh, they're not travelers anymore," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "They're staying indefinitely. Isn't that right, gentlemen?" The men nodded again in that eerie unison. Mrs. Whitmore rose. "Now then, Miss Morrison, before you rest, there's one small house rule we must discuss." Clara frowned. "What kind of rule?" The widow walked to the far corner, where shadows gathered thick. Chains rattled softly. Clara's breath caught. A man sat there, huge, silent, bound. Not just a man, an Apache. His hair long and black, his wrists shackled in iron, his chest bare except for torn fabric and old scars. His eyes burned with fury and pride. "This," Mrs. Whitmore said lightly, "is one of my permanent guests, a savage I've been attempting to civilize." "You keep a man in chains?" Clara said, horrified. "Oh, he's dangerous. Killed 3 men. They were going to hang him, but I saved him. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption." The Apache said nothing, but his gaze found Clara's. For a heartbeat, she saw not rage, but something else, warning. Mrs. Whitmore turned to her with that same cold smile. "Now, my rule. I provide companionship as well as shelter. Every woman guest must choose a man for the night, for protection, of course." Clara stood, the stew heavy in her stomach. "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Whitmore gestured gracefully, to the 3 hollow men at the table, then to the chained warrior. "Pick a man," she said softly. "He's yours tonight." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the storm clawing at the windows. Clara stared at Mrs. Whitmore, unable to believe what she'd just heard. The widow stood calm and composed, as if she'd suggested nothing more unusual than pouring another cup of coffee. "I don't understand," Clara said finally, her voice tight. "It's simple, child," Mrs. Whitmore replied, gliding closer. "A woman alone is vulnerable in these parts. I insist all my female guests choose a companion for the night, someone to ensure their safety. House rules." "I don't need protection," Clara said. "I'll pay double for a private room." Mrs. Whitmore's smile didn't waver, but her eyes turned sharp. "It's not about payment. It's about peace of mind. Safety requires companionship. Companionship requires choice." The 3 men at the table shifted uneasily. The youngest, Robert, opened his mouth to speak, but the bearded one, James if she recalled correctly, shot him a warning look. Silence fell again. Mrs. Whitmore gestured toward the chained Apache in the corner. "Surely you wouldn't choose him. He's a savage, a killer. I keep him here as an example of what happens to those who resist refinement." The man didn't move, didn't speak, but his dark eyes blazed with restrained fury. He wasn't broken like the others. Not yet. Clara's pulse pounded. The widow was mad, that much was clear, but the storm outside was worse than ever, and Buttercup couldn't make another mile. She was trapped. "If I must choose," Clara said carefully, "I'd like to speak to them first." Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Of course. Gentlemen, Do be polite to our guest." Clara approached the table. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. Theodore, the oldest, avoided her eyes. James sat stiff and rigid. Robert trembled slightly, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "How long have you been staying here?" she asked softly. Theodore opened his mouth, but no sound came. He swallowed hard, forcing the words. "A while," he said finally. "Time works different here." Clara frowned. "Different how?" Before he could answer, James kicked him under the table. "We're comfortable," he said quickly. "Mrs. Whitmore takes good care of us." "Is that so?" Clara asked. "Yes," James said, his tone flat. "Very good care." Robert's lips twitched, as if holding back words. Then, in a whisper so faint she almost missed it, he said, "Choose carefully. Some choices are safer than others." Mrs. Whitmore's voice snapped through the air like a whip. "Enough chatter. Miss Morrison, it's late. Make your choice." Clara turned slowly, scanning the faces before her. The three men, broken, afraid, hollow. The Apache, silent, strong, unyielding. His eyes met hers again, and she saw something there. Not pleading, not hope, something like defiance. A spark of life that hadn't been stolen. "I've made my decision," Clara said, steadying her voice. Mrs. Whitmore's pale eyes gleamed. "And which gentleman will have the honor?" "Mr. Henley," Clara said, nodding toward the bearded man. James blinked, startled. The others looked almost relieved. "An excellent choice," Mrs. Whitmore said, though her smile faltered for the first time. "James will take good care of you. Won't you, dear?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, bowing his head. "Good," Mrs. Whitmore said briskly. "I'll have hot water sent up for washing. Breakfast is at 7 sharp. Oh, and Miss Morrison." She paused, her voice silk and steel. "Best stay in your room after dark. So many hallways, so many locked doors. I'd hate for you to get lost." Clara nodded, saying nothing. The widow turned and left the room, her black skirts whispering across the floor. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the windows in their frames. As soon as the sound of her footsteps faded, Theodore buried his face in his hands. Robert began to rock slowly, whispering something under his breath. James stood stiffly. "This way," he said. Clara followed him down a dim hallway and up a narrow staircase that groaned under their weight. The second floor smelled faintly of medicine and dust. Door after door lined the corridor, all closed, each with a small brass number. James stopped at number 7. He produced a key from his vest pocket and unlocked the door. Inside, the room was small but tidy. A brass bed, a washstand, a wardrobe. The curtains were drawn tight. When the door shut behind them, James turned the key and exhaled shakily. "We can speak now," he whispered, "but only quietly. The walls have ears." Clara frowned. "What is this place, Mr. Henley?" He moved closer, voice trembling. "A prison, a trap. She finds people, travelers like us, and keeps them here. Feeds them, drugs them, breaks them." "Drugs?" Clara whispered. He nodded. "The food, the coffee, even the air in this house. It's all laced with something. After a few days, your mind clouds. You forget who you were. You stop wanting to leave." Clara's stomach twisted. She thought of the meal she'd just eaten, the strange numbness in her fingers. "I've been here months," James said. "Maybe longer. I don't know anymore. Time slips away. Theodore came before me. Robert after. We tried to fight her at first, but she has ways. Threats. Punishments." "What about him?" Clara asked. "The Apache?" James' eyes darted toward the door as if even saying it was dangerous. "She calls him Joseph, but that's not his name. He killed 3 of her men when they tried to capture him, nearly escaped twice. She keeps him chained because she can't break him. That's why she hates him most." Clara's mind raced. "We have to get out, all of us." He laughed softly, a hollow sound. "We've tried. Every door locked, every window barred. The house has secret passages she uses to move unseen. She always knows what we plan before we do. There has to be a way, Clara said. Something she missed. James hesitated, then reached into his boot. He pulled out a small, folded paper and handed it to her. A map. Theodore found it months ago. Shows the hidden corridors. There's one that leads to her study, where she keeps her medicines and keys. Clara unfolded it carefully. The lines were crude but clear enough, a network of passages running through the walls like veins. If we can reach her study, she said, we can find the key to the Apache's chains, and maybe a way out. James nodded. But be careful, she moves at night. Sometimes we hear her footsteps where no one should be, and sometimes— He trailed off, eyes dark. Sometimes we hear things in the walls. Whispers. Crying. A knock startled them both. Hot water, came a soft voice from the other side. James opened the door just enough for a young woman to slip in. She carried a pitcher and basin, her sleeves rolled up. Bruises marred her wrists. She set the items down, never meeting Clara's eyes, and hurried out again. Another prisoner? Clara asked quietly. James nodded. Servant. Name's Ayana. Been here 2 years. She's afraid to speak, but she knows everything that happens in this house. Quote. He stepped closer, his face drawn and weary. Tomorrow, at breakfast, pretend everything's normal. Don't let her suspect you know. Eat little, drink less, and whatever happens, don't trust anything Mrs. Whitmore offers you. Clara folded the map and hid it in her boot. We'll end this, she said. I promise. James gave a broken smile. If anyone can, it's you. You still have fight in you. The rest of us, we lost ours a long time ago. He turned toward the door. Get some rest. You'll need it. Tomorrow we start looking for a way out. As the door clicked shut behind him, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering lamp. The storm raged on outside, but it wasn't the thunder keeping her awake. It was the sound of chains, faint, rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep below the house. And through that steady rattle, she thought she heard something else, a voice, a whisper, calling her name, Clara. She froze, heart pounding. The sound came again. Low, distant, but real, from the cellar. Wait, before we move on. What do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The house had gone quiet, except for the ticking of an unseen clock. Clara waited until the sounds of footsteps faded from the hall. Then she rose, slipped her boots back on, and pulled the folded map from her boot. The ink was smudged, but the path was clear. The narrow service stair, the east wing, the study. And below it all, the cellar where she'd heard the voice. She moved like a shadow through the hallway, lamplight flickering through cracks in the walls. The portraits lining the corridor watched her with blank eyes. One showed a young woman in a white dress, smiling faintly beneath a brass plate that read Catherine Whitmore, 1847 to 1869. Mrs. Whitmore's daughter, Clara guessed. Something about that smile looked haunted. She found the hidden door behind a linen closet and slipped inside. The passage was narrow and cold, walls of rough timber pressed close on either side. Dust coated her fingers as she steadied herself on the steps. The air smelled of damp earth and something chemical. At the top of the stairs stood a door. Locked. Clara knelt, pulling a hairpin from her bun. The tumblers clicked softly, and the door swung open to reveal Mrs. Whitmore's study. It was tidy, almost surgical. Glass bottles lined the shelves, filled with powders and liquids. Ledgers lay stacked on a wide desk. The air smelled faintly of medicine and lye. Clara rifled through the drawers. Papers, letters, small vials marked with initials. One file read, TB, another JH, another RC. The names hit her like a blow. Theodore Blackwood, James Henley, Robert Crane. She flipped open the ledger. Lines of perfect handwriting filled the page. Notes about behavioral correction, dependent cycles, and compliance through controlled dosing. The older entries were worse. Subject expired. Cause, refusal to comply. Clara's hands trembled. How many had come before her? A glint caught her eye, a key hanging on a hook by the curtain. "Heavy iron," marked Apache. She slipped it into her pocket. Then she heard it. Footsteps in the hall. She blew out her lamp, heart hammering. The door creaked open. Mrs. Whitmore stepped inside, holding her own lamp, the light spilling over her sharp features. She moved straight to the desk, opening the ledger Clara had just read. "Resistance in subject RC increasing," the widow murmured to herself. "Double his dosage." "And the woman, Miss Morrison, promising subject, will begin observation tomorrow." Clara bit her lip to keep from gasping. Mrs. Whitmore paused, sniffing the air. "Wet leather," she whispered. "How curious." For one terrible moment, her eyes swept toward the closet where Clara hid. Then she shrugged, made a note, and turned to leave. The instant she was gone, Clara slipped out and ran. Down the passage, through twisting halls, following the faint sound of the storm outside. She found another door, this one leading to the cellar stairs. Cold air hit her face. The smell of earth and iron grew stronger as she descended. A narrow corridor opened into a stone chamber lined with wine racks. At the far end, a heavy door waited, reinforced with iron bands. From inside came the faint sound of chains moving. She lifted the lamp and peered through the barred window. Two dark eyes stared back. Clara turned the key. The lock clicked. The door swung open, and there he was, the Apache. Even in the dim light, he looked larger than life, his shoulders broad, his arms scarred but strong. His wrists were raw where the irons had rubbed. For a moment he didn't move, only watched her. "I'm here to help," she whispered. "Please, don't make noise." He didn't answer, only tilted his head slightly. His eyes flicked to the key in her hand. She moved closer, unlocking the shackles one by one. When the last chain fell, he stood, towering over her. He could have crushed her easily, but he didn't. He just looked at her with quiet intensity, then nodded once. "You understand me?" she asked softly. He nodded again. "Can you speak?" He touched his throat and shook his head. "All right," she whispered. "Then we'll have to trust each other." Footsteps thundered above. Shouts. Mrs. Whitmore had discovered the missing key. The Apache's head snapped up. He motioned sharply for her to follow, leading her deeper into the cellar. The passage twisted past stacks of old trunks and barrels. Then, from the stairway behind them, Mrs. Whitmore's voice echoed through the dark. "Find them! Bring them to me alive if you can!" The Apache glanced back, then pushed Clara into a side room filled with broken furniture. The door burst open a moment later. Two of the widow's farmhands rushed in, rifles raised. The Apache moved like a storm. He grabbed the first man's gun, snapped it free, and swung it hard. The man crumpled. Clara fired at the second, her shot grazing his shoulder. He screamed and fled. But more voices were coming. Then Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hand holding a small glass syringe. The liquid inside gleamed clear as water. "One more step," she said coldly, "and I stop her heart." The Apache froze, eyes locked on the needle pointed at Clara's throat. "Drop the weapon," Mrs. Whitmore ordered. He hesitated, then slowly lowered the rifle. Clara did the same with her gun. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was thin. "You could have chosen comfort, Miss Morrison, safety, a soft bed and the illusion of peace. But you had to fight. Why?" "Because some things aren't worth surviving if it means losing yourself," Clara said. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes flickered. "You speak like someone who's never lost everything. My daughter thought the same, until she betrayed me." "Your daughter?" "She wanted to destroy my work, to free them. My own blood turned against me. I did what was necessary, for science, for order." "You killed her," Clara said. Mrs. Whitmore's voice trembled. "She forced me. She was weak. I had to make her death useful." The syringe shook in her hand. Then a deep voice filled the air. "Ayana." Mrs. Whitmore turned sharply. The Apache's lips had moved. His voice, though rough, carried strength. "My name is Ayana." For one stunned second, she froze. It was all Clara needed. She lunged forward, striking the widow's wrist. The syringe shattered, its contents spilling onto the stone floor. Mrs. Whitmore screamed, clawing for a small pistol hidden in her skirt, but Ayana was faster. He caught her arm, twisting it until the gun clattered away. "Hold her!" Clara shouted. Ayana forced her to her knees, binding her wrists with the same chains that had once held him. "You think this ends me?" Mrs. Whitmore hissed. "They'll die without my medicine. Without me, they'll rot from within." "We'll take that chance," Clara said. "You've stolen enough lives." The house above trembled with the wind. Ayana looked at Clara and spoke again, slowly, his voice deep and steady. "Iron for iron. Justice." Clara nodded. Justice. Together they dragged Mrs. Whitmore upstairs. In the parlor, the three men stood waiting. Theodore, James, and Robert, pale and shaking but free. Behind them, the servant girl, Anna, held a lantern, her eyes wide. "It's over," Clara said. "She won't hurt anyone again." The widow laughed, low and hollow. "Fools! You think you're free? The poison's already in you. The craving, the confusion. You'll never escape me." "Maybe not," Theodore said, his voice rough. "But at least now we can try." Ayana pushed Mrs. Whitmore into a chair. Chains clanked. "Where are the keys?" Clara demanded. The widow only smiled, but Ayana's cold stare made her answer. "Behind the cabinet, in my study." Clara found them minutes later, dozens of keys, letters, and journals, enough proof to damn the widow forever. By dawn, the storm had broken. The sky was pale gray, the world washed clean. Clara saddled Buttercup and looked back at the house, now silent. Inside, the broken men began their first steps toward freedom. The servant girls tended fires and windows long shuttered. And in the cellar, Ayana stood watch over his former captor. The chains now hers. "You could leave," Clara said softly. "You're free now." He looked out at the horizon, then back at her. "Not yet, too many graves." Clara nodded. "Then we'll send word to the marshal. Bring help." As she rode away through the wet prairie, the wind carried a single sound, the clink of iron chains and a man's deep voice murmuring to the dawn. No more chains. The house on the prairie stood quiet at last. No screams, no secrets, only the echo of a storm that had passed. And the woman who had once ridden through the rain in search of shelter now rode toward the sunrise, carrying justice in her saddlebag and hope in her heart.